Mama Cass didn't die because she was overweight. She died in a world that never let her forget she was. On July 29, 1974, one of the greatest voices of the 1960s fell silent forever. Mama Cass Elliott was only 32 years old when she passed away in a London apartment after completing a successful concert engagement. But almost immediately, a cruel story spread across the world. Newspapers and gossip columns claimed that she had choked to death on a ham sandwich. It was a sensational headline, and one that perfectly fed the public's long-standing obsession with her weight. There was just one problem. It wasn't true. The autopsy found no food in her airway. Her official cause of death was a heart attack. Yet the false rumor spread faster than the truth, becoming one of the most enduring myths in music history. Even after her death, people chose to mock her body instead of celebrating the extraordinary talent she left behind. This is the story of Mama Cass, the legendary voice of the mamas and the papas, a remarkably gifted woman whose incredible talent inspired millions, yet who spent much of her life being judged, ridiculed, and discriminated against because of her weight. That relentless prejudice shaped her choices, damaged her confidence, and ultimately contributed to many of the heartbreaking tragedies that defined her life. Part 2. A little girl with an extraordinary voice, but never the right appearance. Long before the world knew her as Mama Cass, she was simply Ellen Naomi Cohen, a little girl born on September 19, 1941, in Baltimore, Maryland. She grew up in a Jewish family descended from Russian immigrants who had come to America hoping for a better life. Like many immigrant families of the era, the Cohens struggled financially. Her father, Philip Cohen, worked tirelessly in the food business to support the family, while her mother, Bess, devoted herself to raising their children. Money was often scarce, but love and encouragement were never in short supply. Even as a child, Ellen possessed something that could not be bought or taught: a remarkable voice. Family members remembered her singing constantly around the house, filling every room with confidence and joy. She had an infectious personality, an unmistakable laugh, and a natural ability to entertain anyone around her. Whenever there was a school play or community performance, Ellen eagerly volunteered. The stage wasn't simply a hobby. It felt like the place where she truly belonged. Unlike many future singers, however, her first dream wasn't to become a recording star. She dreamed of performing on Broadway. After seeing the hit musical The Music Man, she became fascinated with theater and imagined herself standing beneath the bright lights of New York, captivating audiences night after night. While other children imagined ordinary careers, Ellen imagined applause. As she entered her teenage years, she reinvented herself with a new stage name, Cass Elliott. The new name represented more than just a professional identity. It was an attempt to create a version of herself that seemed more glamorous, more confident, and perhaps more acceptable to the world she desperately wanted to enter. But there was one obstacle she could never escape: her weight. Even before she became famous, people rarely spoke about her voice before mentioning her appearance. Teachers, classmates, talent scouts, even strangers often noticed her size first and her talent second. In an era when Hollywood celebrated impossibly thin actresses and female performers were expected to fit a very narrow standard of beauty, Cass found herself constantly reminded that she didn't look like a star. It was a painful contradiction. Whenever she sang, audiences were captivated. Yet the moment the applause ended, conversations often shifted away from her performance and back to her body. Instead of hearing, "What an incredible voice," she too often heard comments about her weight. Each remark seemed small on its own, but together they slowly built an invisible prison around her self-esteem. Over time, Cass began to internalize those judgments. She started believing that talent alone would never be enough. If people couldn't see beyond her appearance, perhaps she would never truly belong in the entertainment industry she loved so deeply. Those early insecurities would follow her into adulthood. Every rejection would feel more personal. Every criticism would cut more deeply. And every success would come with the lingering fear that it might disappear unless she somehow changed the way she looked. The world saw a cheerful young woman with a booming laugh and extraordinary charisma. But beneath that radiant smile was someone quietly asking herself a heartbreaking question. Will anyone ever hear my voice before they judge my body? It was a question that would shape nearly every chapter of Mama Cass's life, and one she would spend years trying, unsuccessfully, to answer. By the early 1960s, Cass Elliott had already proven she belonged in music. After moving to New York, she performed with folk groups such as the Big Three and later the Mugwumps, earning a reputation as one of the most powerful young vocalists on the folk scene. Fellow musicians admired her range, her flawless pitch, and the emotional depth she brought to every song. It was during her time with the Mugwumps that she met a young Canadian singer named Denny Doherty. For Cass, it was love almost from the beginning. Denny was charming, handsome, and shared her passion for music. She believed they were destined to perform together, perhaps even build a life together. But while Cass quietly fell in love, Denny never returned her feelings. Friends later suggested that one reason was painfully obvious. He couldn't see beyond her appearance. Heartbroken but unwilling to give up, Cass remained determined to stay close to him. When the Mugwumps disbanded in 1964, Denny joined a new folk group formed by John Phillips and his wife Michelle Phillips, known at the time as the New Journeymen. Cass desperately wanted to join them, not only because Denny was there, but because she knew the group's harmonies were missing something. She could hear it. She believed her voice could complete the sound. Denny agreed. He knew how extraordinary Cass was. But one man stood firmly in her way: John Phillips. According to numerous accounts from band members and friends, John repeatedly refused to let Cass join the group. Publicly, he claimed that her voice wasn't the right fit for his vocal arrangements. Privately, however, the truth was far more painful. It wasn't her voice, it was her weight. John believed Cass was simply too heavy to become part of the band's image. At a time when the music industry increasingly valued appearance alongside talent, he worried that audiences would reject a singer who didn't fit Hollywood's narrow beauty standards. Imagine hearing that. Not that you lack talent, not that you need more practice, but that you don't look like someone worthy of success. For Cass, it was devastating. Yet instead of walking away, she refused to surrender. She continued following the group, attending rehearsals, and doing everything she could to prove she belonged. Some accounts even describe how she was treated more like an outsider than a fellow musician. Allowed to sing during rehearsals but excluded from performances, while enduring jokes and dismissive comments about her appearance. Years later, an almost mythical story emerged to explain how Cass finally joined the band. According to the legend, while vacationing in the Virgin Islands, a metal pipe accidentally fell and struck her on the head. Miraculously, the accident supposedly changed her singing voice, allowing her to reach the higher notes John Phillips had always wanted. Only then, the story claimed, was she invited into the group. It was an entertaining tale, but it wasn't true. Many people close to the band later revealed that the story served a different purpose: to hide an uncomfortable reality. Admitting that one of the greatest singers of her generation had been rejected because of her weight would have exposed an ugly truth about the music industry, and about the people who eventually became her bandmates. In the end, Cass Elliott joined the group not because her talent had suddenly improved, but because it had been impossible to ignore all along. She had won her place. But the battle for acceptance was far from over. The applause would soon come. So would the cruelty. Part 4. Fame could not silence the cruelty. By 1965, Cass Elliott had finally achieved the dream she had fought so hard for. The newly renamed The Mamas and the Papas exploded onto the American music scene with a sound unlike anything audiences had heard before. Their rich four-part harmonies quickly became the soundtrack of an entire generation. Songs like California Dreamin' and Monday Monday climbed the charts, earning critical acclaim and millions of devoted fans around the world. At the center of that unforgettable sound was Cass. Her warm, powerful contralto gave the group's harmonies their depth and emotion. Even decades later, music critics would describe her voice as the foundation upon which the band's signature sound was built. During rehearsals, fellow musicians often admitted that when Cass began to sing, everyone else instinctively adjusted their voices around hers. She had finally become the star she had always dreamed of being. But success changed almost everything, except the way people saw her. Behind the applause and platinum records, the jokes about her weight never stopped. If anything, they became even more public. Perhaps the most painful example came from the people who were supposed to be her closest friends. Within the band, Cass's weight remained a constant source of ridicule. Instead of celebrating the woman whose voice had helped make them famous, some of her bandmates continued making jokes at her expense. The teasing became so common that it slowly shaped the public's perception of her. Before long, Ellen Naomi Cohen almost disappeared. The world knew her only as Mama Cass. Although the nickname eventually became iconic, many believe it was never entirely one of affection. It constantly reminded audiences that Cass was the big one in the group, the member whose appearance made her stand out before her talent did. Then came a moment that many fans still find heartbreaking today. In the band's autobiographical song Creek Alley, the lyrics included the line, "Nobody's getting fat except Mama Cass." The audience laughed. Radio stations played it repeatedly. Fans sang along. For many listeners, it sounded like harmless humor. For Cass, it was something else entirely. Imagine hearing thousands of strangers cheer every night while singing a joke about the very insecurity that had haunted you since childhood. The success of the song only reinforced the message she had been hearing her entire life. That no matter how beautifully she sang, people would always notice her body first. Ironically, while critics praised the band's harmonies, interviews often focused on Cass's appearance instead of her artistry. Magazine articles discussed her weight almost as frequently as her performances. Television hosts made jokes that would be considered cruel and unacceptable today, yet at the time they were treated as ordinary entertainment. Cass usually laughed along. She smiled. She cracked jokes about herself before anyone else could. To the public, she appeared confident, funny, and larger than life. But those closest to her understood that the humor often hid something much deeper. Every joke became another reminder that fame had not earned her acceptance. Every magazine headline strengthened the belief that she would never be judged solely by her extraordinary gift. The tragic irony was impossible to ignore. Millions of people loved listening to her voice. Far fewer were willing to look beyond her appearance. For Cass Elliott, becoming a superstar did not end the battle against prejudice. It simply placed that battle under the brightest spotlight imaginable. And with each passing year, the emotional wounds grew deeper, quietly pushing her toward choices that would one day threaten not only her career, but her life. Part 5. Invisible Wounds. Love, Insecurity, and Loneliness. If the world constantly reminded Cass Elliott that she wasn't beautiful enough, there was one person she hoped would finally make her believe otherwise. His name was Denny Doherty. From the moment they met in the Mugwumps, Cass fell deeply in love with the easygoing Canadian singer. She admired his voice, his humor, and the effortless charm that seemed to draw everyone toward him. To her, Denny represented more than a bandmate. He represented acceptance. She dreamed that if the man she loved could love her back, perhaps all the cruel words about her appearance wouldn't matter anymore. But life had another heartbreak waiting. Denny never returned her feelings. Instead, he fell in love with Michelle Phillips, the striking blonde beauty of the Mamas and the Papas, and the wife of bandleader John Phillips. Their secret affair became one of the band's most infamous scandals. For Cass, it was devastating. She wasn't simply losing the man she loved. She was watching him choose someone who embodied everything society told her she could never be. Years later, Michelle Phillips recalled Cass confronting her in tears, saying, "You can have any man in the world. Why did you have to take the only one I love?" It wasn't anger that made those words unforgettable. It was heartbreak. Cass wasn't jealous because Michelle was more talented. She believed Michelle was prettier. And after years of hearing that beauty mattered more than ability, Cass couldn't help but wonder if that was why Denny had never truly seen her. The rejection cut deeper than anyone realized. Friends described Cass as warm, generous, and endlessly funny in public, but privately she carried enormous emotional pain. Like many performers, she became an expert at hiding sadness behind laughter. The louder she made everyone else laugh, the easier it became to conceal her own loneliness. As the emotional wounds deepened, Cass searched for ways to escape them. The music scene of the late 1960s was filled with alcohol, drugs, and endless parties, and Cass was no exception. She immersed herself in the fast-paced world surrounding the band, hoping that success, excitement, and constant social gatherings might drown out the insecurity she could never quite silence. But no party lasted forever. When the music stopped, the same doubts returned, the same mirror, the same painful belief that she simply wasn't enough. Eventually, that emotional burden led her toward an even more dangerous obsession. If she couldn't change people's opinions, perhaps she could change herself. Cass began experimenting with increasingly extreme diets, convinced that losing weight might finally earn her the acceptance she had spent her entire life chasing. Every pound lost became more than a physical goal. It became a desperate attempt to prove that she deserved love, respect, and recognition. The tragedy was that none of those things had ever depended on her appearance. She already possessed one of the greatest voices of her generation. She had already become one of America's biggest stars. Yet years of rejection had convinced her that those achievements were never enough. Her heart wasn't the only thing that had been broken. Little by little, her confidence was breaking too. And once a person begins believing that their worth depends on changing who they are, the consequences can become far more dangerous than anyone realizes. For Mama Cass, the battle was no longer against critics or cruel headlines. It had become a battle with herself. Part 6. The diet that nearly destroyed her. By the end of the 1960s, Cass Elliott had accomplished what few artists ever could. She had sold millions of records, become one of the defining voices of her generation, and was recognized around the world. But in her own mind, one obstacle still stood between her and complete success: her weight. When the mamas and the papas came to an end, Cass was determined to prove that she could succeed on her own. In 1969, she signed a prestigious solo contract with Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas. It was an extraordinary opportunity, one that promised 6 figures and could establish her as a major solo entertainer. To most performers, the contract was proof that they had already made it. To Cass, it felt like another audition. She feared that critics weren't waiting to hear her sing. They were waiting to see how she looked. Convinced that becoming thinner would finally silence years of ridicule, Cass embarked on an extreme weight loss program. According to those close to her, she fasted for 4 days every week, surviving on little more than liquids for nearly 7 months. The results were dramatic. She reportedly lost more than 90 pounds, over 40 kilograms. People noticed. Newspapers praised her transformation. Friends commented on how different she looked. For a brief moment, it seemed as though she had finally achieved what the world had always demanded of her. But her body was paying a terrible price. Months of severe dieting deprived her of the nutrients and strength she desperately needed. Instead of becoming healthier, she became dangerously ill. She developed acute tonsillitis, infectious mononucleosis, hepatitis, and hemorrhaging vocal cords, the very instrument that had made her famous. Her voice was beginning to fail. Yet even then, Cass refused to cancel. She had spent too many years trying to prove herself. When opening night arrived in Las Vegas, celebrities filled the audience, eager to witness the solo debut of one of America's biggest stars. But behind the curtain stood a woman who was physically exhausted. She had barely rehearsed. Her body was weakened by illness, and every note demanded more strength than she had left. As the performance unfolded, it became painfully clear that something was wrong. Her voice lacked its usual power. She struggled to finish songs. The confidence that had once captivated audiences was replaced by visible fatigue. The reviews were merciless. Instead of asking why she had been pushed to such extremes, critics mocked the performance. Some newspapers compared her disastrous debut to a catastrophe. Caesar's Palace canceled the remainder of her engagement, and the failure became national news. Once again, the headlines focused on Cass Elliott, but not on the impossible pressure that had brought her there. Looking back today, the tragedy is impossible to ignore. For years, people assumed that Cass's greatest health risk was being overweight. The evidence tells a different story. She did not collapse because she refused to diet. She collapsed after months of starving herself in a desperate attempt to satisfy society's expectations. The world had convinced her that becoming thinner would solve everything. Instead, it robbed her of her health, damaged the voice that had made her famous, and shattered the confidence she had fought so hard to build. Mama Cass did not almost lose her life because she was fat. She nearly lost it trying not to be. Part 7. Her Death, and the Cruelest Lie Ever Told. On the night of July 29, 1974, Cass Elliott returned to her apartment in London's elegant Mayfair district after completing a triumphant 2-week engagement at the London Palladium. Friends who had seen her during those final days remembered her as cheerful and optimistic. Despite feeling exhausted after weeks of performances, she was already making plans for future concerts and new recording projects. No one imagined that her career and her life were about to end. The following afternoon, Cass failed to answer her telephone. Concerned, her secretary entered her bedroom and made a heartbreaking discovery. Mama Cass Elliott was dead. She was only 32 years old. The official investigation found that she had died from heart failure, most likely brought on by underlying cardiac problems combined with years of physical stress. The medical examiner found no evidence of drugs, no evidence of suicide, and, most importantly, no food in her airway. It should have been the end of the story. Instead, it became the beginning of one of the cruelest myths in entertainment history. Almost immediately, newspapers began reporting that Cass had died after choking on a ham sandwich. Some articles even claimed that a half-eaten sandwich had been found beside her bed and quickly transformed that unverified detail into the supposed cause of death. The story spread like wildfire. Television repeated it. Radio hosts joked about it. Newspapers around the world printed it as fact. Within days, millions of people believed that one of the greatest singers of the 1960s had literally been killed by her own appetite. The rumor perfectly matched the stereotype that had followed Cass throughout her life. People accepted it because it confirmed what they already believed about her. Few stopped to ask whether it was actually true. The truth was far less sensational. The autopsy clearly concluded that Cass had not choked to death. There was no obstruction in her throat, no food blocking her airway, and no medical evidence supporting the claim. Yet corrections rarely receive the same attention as shocking headlines. By the time the facts emerged, the lie had already traveled around the world. For decades, people continued repeating it. Even today, many still believe that Mama Cass died with a sandwich in her hand. It is one of the most persistent false stories ever attached to a famous musician. Perhaps that is the saddest part of all. Throughout her entire career, Cass fought to be recognized for her extraordinary voice rather than her appearance. Even after her death, many people remembered her not for California Dreamin, Monday, Monday, or Dream a Little Dream of Me, but for a joke that was never true. The same prejudice that had haunted her while she was alive continued long after she was gone. Her body remained the headline. Her music became the footnote. Looking back today, the ham sandwich story reveals far more about society than it does about Mama Cass. It exposed how easily the public accepted a humiliating rumor simply because it fit their assumptions about an overweight woman. Cass Elliott did not deserve to have the final chapter of her life rewritten as a punchline. She deserved to be remembered for the gift that made millions fall in love with her voice. Yet even in death, the world found it easier to laugh at her weight than to listen to her songs. And perhaps that was the greatest injustice of all. Part 8. A legacy that outlived every cruel judgment. For many years after Mama Cass Elliott's death, one mystery remained unsolved. Who was the father of her only daughter, Owen Vanessa Elliott? Cass had fiercely protected her daughter's privacy while she was alive, refusing to reveal the father's identity despite relentless media speculation. She never allowed the tabloids to turn Owen into another headline. It was one final act of love from a mother who had spent her entire life trying to shield the people she cared about from public cruelty. Decades later, Michelle Phillips finally revealed that Owen's father was Chuck Day, a guitarist who had played on some of the Mamas and the Papas' most famous recordings. By then, however, the revelation mattered far less than the legacy Cass had already left behind. Time had accomplished something that fame never could. It had given people perspective. As the years passed, musicians, critics, and fans began looking beyond the jokes, the headlines, and the stereotypes. They returned to the music itself. And there, they found the truth. In 1998, the Mamas and the Papas were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. When the surviving members reunited to perform California Dreamin, they faced an impossible challenge. Cass was gone. To recreate the band's famous harmonies, they brought in 3 backing singers, 3 voices to replace one. And yet, according to many who watched the performance, something was still missing. The harmonies were beautiful, but the soul of the music wasn't there. Cass Elliott's voice had never simply blended with the others. It had held them together. More than 2 decades later, in 2022, another long-overdue honor finally arrived. Mama Cass received her own star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, attended by family, friends, and former bandmate Michelle Phillips. It was a recognition that many fans believed should have come decades earlier. Perhaps even more meaningful than the official awards has been the dramatic change in how people remember her today. Read the comments beneath almost any video of Mama Cass, and a clear pattern emerges. People no longer talk first about her weight. They talk about her voice. Cass was the soul of the band. They were nothing without her. No one could ever replace Mama Cass. Many fans have also begun acknowledging something that previous generations rarely discussed. Body shaming destroyed a legend. Those words appear again and again, not as exaggeration, but as a painful reflection on how society treated one of its greatest singers. History has a way of correcting its mistakes. The same woman who was once mocked for her appearance is now celebrated for her extraordinary gift. The same voice that critics once overlooked is now recognized as one of the finest in American popular music. Mama Cass never truly needed to change her body. The world needed to change the way it looked at her. Her story is no longer just about one remarkable singer. It is a warning about the damage that prejudice, impossible beauty standards, and careless words can inflict on a human being. It reminds us that behind every joke about someone's appearance is a real person carrying invisible wounds that the world may never see. Mama Cass is not remembered because of her weight. She is remembered because she possessed a voice that an entire generation could never replace. The greatest tragedy was not that she died at the age of 32. The greatest tragedy was that, for far too much of her life, too many people saw only her body and never truly listened to the voice that moved millions of hearts.